this size, and you know, it was a really small conservative movement, but it grew and grew and grew, and then Ronald Reagan had a revolution, and the country changed. And now there are so many people here that you can't even fit them in. The CPAC was sold out about a month ago, and people were calling. I mean, even relatives of the Schlapps were calling to say, you know, we're willing to write a check for any amount of money. Can we get into CPAC? And it was sold out. And I think that, to me, as a foot soldier in the Reagan Revolution, and now a real warrior along with Fred Fleiss, a warrior in the Trump Revolution, it just shows you the power of ideas. And our Korean friends who are here today, they started coming to CPAC. You know, it wasn't CPAC, it wasn't Matt Schlapp, president of CPAC, who called up to the Koreans and said, we want to do something with you. They came and they said, we're worried about our country, and we saw how you started with nothing, and you created a conservative movement that not only elected Ronald Reagan, but a conservative movement that then fell by the wayside for 15 years, and you created another conservative revolution that then brought Trump to the White House. So the reason we're having this panel is because of our Korean friends who are facing a lot of the same problems that the United States has faced in the last 10 or 15 years. And it's an acknowledgement of that the people at CPAC, I'm on the American Conservative Union Board, we decided that it would be very important to talk about Korea, because everybody thinks about Russia, the Middle East, terrorists, China, but people aren't paying attention to the Korean Peninsula. And I think that is going to be where a lot of the issues of the next decade are going to be settled or not settled, is in the Korean Peninsula. So thank you all for coming. I want to start out by introducing our fellow panelists and telling you who I am. So my name is K.T. McFarland. I was a veteran, not a military veteran, but a worker in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations. And I was a traditional Republican foreign policy establishment, card-carrying member, went to all the right graduate schools, went to all the right Council on Foreign Relations meetings. And about 10 years ago, I realized that the Republican and Democrat foreign policy establishments were heading in the wrong direction, that we were paying way too much attention to the Middle East. We were dependent on Middle East oil, and so we were sucked into all of their psychodramas and forever wars, and that the real problems of the world and the real strategic threat to the United States was happening in Asia and in Northeast Asia, and particularly with China. So I did not endorse or support any of the traditional Republican candidates. I was a Fox News national security analyst on television every day talking to the American people about the foreign policy issues which were near and dear to my heart. And then Trump came along and I supported him because he understood. He was made fun of during the campaign because he kept saying China, 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 and people thought he was China obsessed. I thought he was right. And so I supported him. I was probably the first sort of well-known national conservative foreign policy expert who did, certainly the only woman. And then when President Trump was elected, I was one of his first appointments as Deputy National Security Advisor. I worked for President Trump for the first critical months where we took his campaign promises and we turned them into policies. And the policies that were set up at the beginning of the Trump administration, whether it was with regard to North Korea, Iran, Middle East, Europe and NATO, Britain and Brexit, and particularly the willingness to stand up to and call China out for its trade abuses, those I'm very happy to say are the policies that have been continued to be followed, and I think with an enormous amount of success. So we're going to have a conversation now about why does Korea matter, what's going on there, why is it changed, and really what does it portend for the United States, not only in our whole relationship with the Korean Peninsula, but really the whole Pacific policy of the United States. And we've got three perfect people, very different backgrounds here to talk to us today. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand when I say who you are, and then what I'd like to do is ask each of our guests to just give us a sort of an up-to-date, where are we now? And then I'm going to quiz them, and then if I run out of questions, you're going to quiz them. And then we're going to ask them what they think at the end to see if they've been paying attention. So our first guest, the first person I want to introduce is Dr. David Chu. Daniel Chu. Oh, Daniel, David, they all sound the same. Daniel Chu, and he's a recent PhD graduate in North Korean studies, research fellow at the Truth Forum, a conservative student organization in Korea. And he's just translated Paul Kengar's 11 Principles of Reagan Conservatism. So he represents the new conservative movement in Korea. And he's also, have you finished your PhD?
Yes, just graduated last year.
That's so cool. My MIT dissertation is still waiting to be finished. Okay, and then secondly, I want to introduce an old colleague and friend of mine, Fred Fleiss. He had a career for decades in the intelligence community, and he can't really tell you what he did. Well, he could, but you wouldn't be able to leave this room. And Fred, when President Trump was elected, Fred was one of the most outspoken people in favor of Trump's policies, not only before he was elected, but after he was elected. And so President Trump asked Fred to come to the White House, to the National Security Council, where there were problems from the very beginning and issues about the staff. And Fred was brought in a very critical role as the Chief of Staff and Executive Secretary of the National Security Council, which he did with great dignity and sophistication and purpose and kept totally under the rug. But he did it all and didn't get the praise he deserved. But he's back out of the White House now, free again. And Fred is now president and CEO of the Center for Security Policy. He is also, you probably recognize him because he's frequently in the media talking about a lot of issues, intelligence, Asia, China. But he's really one of the foremost, I think, one of the foremost national security experts and thoughtful guys in the country. And then finally, bringing up the diplomatic corps is a man who's had decades of experience, Ambassador Cho. He's the former ambassador, Korean ambassador to Australia and to Ireland. He had a 38-year tenure in government, and he specialized in national security, especially pertaining to North Korea's nuclear threats and U.S.-Korean relations. So we have the young scholar who's part of the conservative movement. We have the American expert who knows President Trump. Has he called you lately? He's called me all the time. Is he calling you too?
I can't say.
I know you can't tell me that either. And we have someone who spent decades in the service of his country and Korea, taking Korea from the earliest days when I was a graduate student in Seoul in the early 1970s, and you've helped a nation that in 30 and 40 years has become one of the most sophisticated modern countries in the world, I think in large part thanks to the Korean people. And then you get me as the question asker. Okay, so what's happening in South Korea? I just want to be a little preface of this by saying that when Trump was elected, the first thing that President Obama said to him during the transition was, your biggest problem is going to be North Korea. Nobody knows. If North Korea is your problem, we don't know. Nobody has any good answers. And so Trump had said to me, and when we talked about it, I said, look, North Korea could test nuclear weapons, could test long-range missiles, and nothing's worked. We've tried diplomacy, we've tried carrots and sticks, we threaten them, we give them goodies, but nothing's really worked. They've just clicked along further and further in the development of their nuclear program. And Trump said, we are committed to not allow nuclear weapons, and North Korea to have its hands on nuclear weapons capable of hitting the United States. So the first meeting that I called in the White House Situation Room as Deputy National Security Advisor was to bring all of the agencies of government around, and you're familiar, Fred, because you've chaired a lot of those meetings, and I went around to the Treasury Department, the State Department, the Justice Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Pentagon, and I went around and I said, what do you think what's our Korea policy? What should it be? And it was just same old, same old. And I said, look, none of this stuff has worked for 20 years. Why do you think it's going to work now? President Obama left office and his Korea policy was basically kick the can down the road. It was strategic patience. Well, strategic patience means I don't know what else to do, so I think I'm just going to be patient. So I asked the people around the room, go back to your home agencies, come back to the White House Situation Room in about a week and a half, and I want to hear different ideas. I want to hear you go look under every rock in your intelligence community. Go ask everybody. Think outside the box. Think way outside the box. At one end, I want you to think maybe what would happen if we recognized North Korea as a nuclear weapons state in the international community of nations. What happens on the other end if we have military action against North Korea? What covert operations could we pull off? What intelligence options do we have? What treasury and economic and financial options we have? Anyway, the long and short of it is that we realized there was no silver bullet, nothing was really going to work, but we were able to take a few threads of each of those areas and put them together in what's called the maximum pressure campaign, where the United States is slowly turning up the dial on carrots and on sticks in North Korea. So that was my experience when I left it, but I want to ask you, I want to start, Daniel, with you, and tell the audience, what's happening in South Korea today?
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the organizations for inviting me. Actually, if you look in the brochure, you'll find a different name. It's Dr. Taro, who unfortunately couldn't make it. She was a bit ill, so I have to fill a very big shoes. I feel like a student with professors. But about Korea, about what's happening in Korea right now, and I'm talking about South Korea, not North Korea. And you'll be surprised to hear that freedom is in peril. I was thinking of how I can relate to you what's happening, and I think the best way to describe what's happening in Korea is to imagine that Bernie Sanders wins in November, and just imagine what will happen in the next 4 or 5 years after he wins, after he becomes the president of the United States. And that's happening in Korea right now. In fact, just play with me with another imagination. Imagine that President Trump wasn't acquitted at the Senate last month. And for some reason, somehow, you have fast-forwarded the election process and Bernie Sanders is elected. That's actually what happened in 2016. President Park Geun-hye, the former conservative president, was framed with or some wrongdoing, and there was this big protest. All the liberal media, mass media participated. Even China has helped in the demonstrations. There are evidences that tens of thousands of Chinese students have participated in the candlelight demonstration, which was praised by the New York Times as the most democratic event in Asia in some time. But it wasn't a democratic movement. It was a false narrative that was portrayed against the president. And she was impeached. She wasn't acquitted. She came down, and there was an election, a very fast-forwarded election, and a socialist has taken over. I think most conservatives in Korea will agree that the current President Moon Jae-in is, if not a communist, definitely a socialist-leaning Asian president right now. So that's what's happening. And after he was elected president, the purges started. Four former heads of intelligence under the President Park Geun-hye was imprisoned, and they are still in imprisonment. President Park Geun-hye, of course, was imprisoned and was sentenced to 27 or so years. And some journalists who spoke out against President Moon Jae-in was jailed as well. Some of them are released, some of them are still in jail. In total, last time I counted, there were about 130 individuals, mostly conservative journalists and activists who were jailed by the current Moon Jae-in government. So this is a brief overview of what's happening in South Korea. You may not believe me, but because you probably have never heard of this, but you have to realize that most of the major newspapers that produce English articles that you can read are liberal. They are very left-leaning liberal newspapers. So probably this is the first time you're hearing about this, but I can tell you that many of the conservatives here will attest to what's happening in Korea. Yes.
Let me turn to the ambassador, and I'm going to get back to you, Fred, because I want you to talk about what the Trump administration, how we're seeing this new changing relationship since he took office. But, Mr. Ambassador, you were active in diplomacy during the period of South Korea's ascent. The United States, we had an active policy after the Korean War to say to the South, we will subsidize your economic development. We will be the big brother and provide you with a security guarantee with our U.S.-South Korea treaty. And we want you to develop into a trading partner. We want you to be an open and liberal society. And that's exactly what Korea has done. In fact, so successfully that Korea's economy was thriving. The democracy in Korea was just on the ascent. But something seems to have changed. Now, we still think of Korea as our best friend, and we think of them as a country that is a great democracy, a great trading partner with the United States. But it seems that Korea itself, South Korea, is under a certain amount of tension, and particularly with regard to its relationship not just with the United States, but with North Korea. Could you elaborate on that and how you think things have changed and where we are today from your perspective?
Okay. Well, very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I stepped down from my position in government in 2017. And before that time, I was actually Deputy National Security Advisor in Seoul. So had I stayed on in that position, I could have worked with Katie very closely, actually. So finally we met. And yes.
Everybody meets at CPAC one way or another. So carry on.
Yes. I belong to the generation of Korean people who actually witnessed the transformation of my country from one of the poorest, really depending upon the U.S. assistance for managing the affairs of the state in the 1950s, to a very energetic trading nation, and then on to the member of the G20 in 2008, and also coupled with my country's rather dramatic turnaround into one of these economic force to be reckoned with in the world. Korea has democratized, so democracy has really blossomed. And now we can say anything in the streets of Korea. You can be subject to some criticism from the passers-by lookers on, but nonetheless, you have the freedom of speech in my country, and we are a very different country, very open, cosmopolitan, democratic nation. And we achieved that, of course, through the efforts, toils, blood, and tears of the Korean people. Something we all must actually acknowledge and cheer. At the same time, this Korea's achievement was not Korea's achievement alone, because it only was possible because we were supported by the United States, and our defense was helped by the United States, and U.S. encouraged Korea to become a very vibrant, open, democratic nation, something we finally achieved in the 1990s. Now, something else happened too. With the full exercise of the freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and all political activities, naturally under a democratic system, voices who are rather close to the views of North Korea actually happened too. The views, political views, who do not really support the ROK's alliance with the United States appeared. And we have a big divide in Korea at the moment. And we have a big ongoing the political discussions or defining discussions that can really determine the future of the Korean Peninsula and the Republic of Korea. Having said that, I like to make one thing very, very clear to you. That is, regardless of the political persuasion one belongs to in my country, a vast majority, meaning 92% to be exact, of the Korean population, Korean people believe that it is a good thing that we have this alliance relationship with the United States. Different question. In 20 years' time, would you rather see Korea aligned with the United States or aligned with China? That's another question. And then over 85% say that, sure, after 20 years, we should be aligned with the United States. Only about, I think, 13% say that perhaps we should better align with China. So what I'm saying is that although we have differences domestically about economic policies, internal policies, what kind of policy we should pursue, or whether we should applaud the Korean government's efforts to stem the flow of coronavirus, or we should criticize the Korean government for not doing their job. We have differences, but vast majority of the Korean people believe that U.S. is Korea's friend, and we should be aligned with the United States. So I'd like to make this point very, very clear to you today.
I think that's a really important point to make, is that the U.S., well, first of all, the United States has a security treaty with Korea. In other words, if Korea is attacked by China, whoever, the United States has a treaty commitment to come to Korea's aid. But when Fred Fleiss went to the White House with President Trump, it's a period where we're rethinking a lot of American foreign policy. So how do you see, because you've seen President Trump in action very recently, how do you think that he looks and the American government looks at the relationship not only between the United States and Korea, but Korea, North Korea, South Korea, and potentially what happens with the Korean-China relationship?
Well, it's an honor to be on this panel. Thank you all for coming. And KT, it's great to be on a panel with a fellow former Trump administration NSC staffer. You got to read KT's book about how the deep state drove her out. Unrelated subject, but it's a fabulous book. She's really a hero who has fought to keep her nation safe and to help President Trump succeed. I did meet with the president in August to talk about North Korea in the Oval Office. And while we were there, he motioned to his secretary to bring in the letters. And the secretary brought in a manila envelope full of the letters that he and Kim Jong-un have exchanged. The Kim letters were typed in Korean with English translations. The Trump letters were written in President Trump's handwriting with his traditional giant signature at the bottom, if you've ever seen it. And it looked like two letters exchanged between friends, two friendly leaders, and he was very proud of them. He's proud of this personal diplomacy that has thrown out the diplomatic rule book and years of North Korea taking advantage of U.S. diplomacy to try to create a chance for peace. Now, if you listen to the presidential candidates right now, the Democrats, they're saying that President North Korea policy has failed and they would do better in dealing with North Korea. Yeah, I'd like to see that. We've seen decades of U.S. administrations, Republicans and Democrats, trying to negotiate with the North Koreans. They manipulate what has taken place. They behave themselves for a while. Then they continue their belligerent behavior until we pay them off again. Now, President Trump knows that, and that was the maximum pressure strategy he used in 2017. That was President Trump going to the General Assembly Hall and threatening to totally destroy North Korea if it threatened the United States and its allies. That sent a message that scared the hell out of Kim Jong-un, and it brought Kim Jong-un to agree to meet with the president. And we've offered North Korea a better future with an unorthodox video, which we showed Kim in Singapore of what North Korea would look like if it agreed to a peaceful solution of its differences with South Korea and the United States. Now, we haven't been able to get these talks moving. We know there were talks in Vietnam. They did move for a variety of reasons, not just that Kim wanted to manipulate the talks, and maybe KT knows more about this, but frankly, I think there are people at the State Department who are not on board with President Trump's policies and led the North Korean government to believe that President Trump would be more flexible than he actually was. There's a chance for peace. Kim has actually used the word denuclearized. That was a major step forward. We don't know what that means to the North Koreans. We don't know whether we will get that agreement. But I'm so frustrated when I see intelligence officials and former officials saying this strategy has failed or will fail. This strategy is not played out yet. We're still working with North Korea to try to find a way forward. So the president thinks he's taken a different approach. He has lowered tensions on the Korean Peninsula. He's decreased the chances of a war by miscalculation. We have a long way to go. There's a lot of worrisome signs. We see Kim trying to build his relationships with China and Russia, maybe to get leverage with the United States. There briefly were working level talks in September, but KT, I think that's because the North Koreans saw John Bolton's exit and thought that our policy would have changed. But you and I know Bolton wasn't making our North Korea policy.
There's only one guy who makes American foreign policy.
That's exactly.
He's the guy that sits behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, drinking Diet Cokes incessantly all day long. And when he gets bored, he picks up the phone and says, hey, I want to talk to the president of South Korea, or hey, I want to talk to Xi Jinping in China. He is the only guy who's making the decisions.
So I think that's where we are. The president thinks he has achieved something. Now, concerning South Korea, we are urging the Moon government, please stop making concessions before Kim comes along with what we're trying to negotiate. Please stop moving so far. The Moon government has helped the negotiations with the North, but they're too eager for a deal. They're where the U.S. government usually is. We want a deal more than the rogue state does. That's how we got the terrible nuclear deal with Iran. We wanted that deal so badly, John Kerry gave them everything but the store to get that terrible agreement. And the North Koreans watch this. The Iranians watch what we're doing with North Korea. President Trump wants a deal, but he showed at the Vietnam summit he wants a good deal, and that's the way this is going to play out.
Can I go back to Daniel? I want to ask you, so what is the current situation between the South Korean government, which as you point out is a socialist government, and their ambitions for North Korea? Fred has just implied that really the United States wants a tougher line against North Korea than South Korean government does.
Definitely. The more the United States takes a tougher line on North Korea, it's beneficial for the Moon government because it generates the needed anti-American sentiments, and I can say that it is the United States that's dividing us. It is the United States that's preventing us from achieving peace on the Korean Peninsula. So it helps the Moon government to push his agenda. And his agenda is not very different from the agenda of Kim Jong-un, which is to unify the country, but not under a liberal democracy, but under socialism. It's more than socialism. It's more like a totalitarian, very dark state, more like a theocracy. But obviously, Moon Jae-in is not going to outwardly say that. He is going to achieve this unification, so-called unification, in steps. And the first step is to enter a process that's called the confederational unification, which basically means that it's going to be a one state, a two state, or but two countries united, but with different heads of states, and maybe in steps. We're going to take step-by-step approach to unify the country as a whole, but that will only make it a socialist country because Moon Jae-in, the North Korean state, it has only one party, whereas the South Korean, it's a multi-party system. So it's never going to play out.
So what you're saying, I mean, I think most Americans look at South Korea, and anybody been to South Korea? Okay, oh yeah, a lot of people. Okay, so South Korea we think of as prosperous and advanced, and now you have a free press and free elections. And then we think of North Korea as this like slave labor camp, where the head of South Korea, Kim Jong-un, if he doesn't like his political opponents, he puts them into cages with dogs and they get eaten. So we think, what kind of a unification, is a unification possible? So I want to ask the diplomat in the room, the guy who's had to negotiate deals. Do you think that it would be possible for North and South Korea to unite in the sense of East and West Germany if united? Could North and South Korea, two completely different systems and objectives, what do you see that future going to?
Well, the West Germany and East Germany only was unified when East German people elected different government in East Germany, and they negotiated, and they were unified through a peaceful means. So when you apply that parallel to the Korean Peninsula, it is hardly likely for two Koreas which have such different, starkly different worldviews and systems and ideologies to negotiate a formula for unification. I don't think it's likely at all. So unification formula is there so that the two Koreas can become more similar to the side of freedom and the market economy, I mean. And then two Koreas will be ready to negotiate a unification. Before that happens, the current North Korean government and South Korea can negotiate a unification formula. I don't think it's possible at all. So we have to be very realistic. And about North Korean, if you allow me, nuclear issue, I can say just two things. Three things. One, international community, United States, South Korea tried to convince North Korea to give up nuclear weapons through negotiations for the last 3 decades. And all attempts have failed, not because international community had been at fault, but because North Korea would not give up nuclear weapons no matter what. So before I see the evidence that this time North Korea is really serious about giving up nuclear weapons, even with hefty demands on us, before I see that evidence, I'll have to assume, as a policymaker in foreign policy and national security areas, I have to assume that North Korea would not give up nuclear weapons. So that's still my assumption. Secondly, so we have to prepare not only for the success of negotiations, but also for the failure of the negotiation, realistically speaking. And how do we prepare for that? Two things. One, never ease sanctions on North Korea. Never ease economic sanctions on North Korea. That's the only reason that Kim Jong-un might consider negotiating about nuclear weapons. I should remind you that actually Kim Jong-un from 2011 consistently said he would even, not giving up, but he would even refuse negotiations about nuclear weapons with anybody. And he changed his policies only because, I believe, the very harsh and strong, robust international sanctions placed on North Korea. So never slacken sanctions before any tangible evidence that something is going right. And finally, never undermine the combined defense posture between US and ROK before North Korea gives up nuclear weapons. Never, destroy this very robust framework of defense, combined defense between the United States and ROK, as something that two countries took years to build, because North Korea might say that they might give up nuclear weapons. So just don't do that. So defense, strong defense, hold on to the sanctions, and never rush into hasty assumptions on negotiation with North Koreans. That's my advice.
Let's shift a little bit and ask about the elephant in the room, which is China. We in America, we don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. We're very happy to have a South Korea as a strong American ally. If there is ever unification, we would hope it's on South Korea's terms, not North Korea's terms. But it seems that China is, not only from the U.S. perspective, but from the Korean perspective. Talk us through all of that. What does China look at that relationship and say? What does China look at our relationship with the Koreans and say? And what do you think the prospects are as we are now entering probably a pretty significant period of Chinese instability, perhaps, because of Hong Kong, the coronavirus, their economy is slowing down, they're no longer the bright boy on the world stage. So talk to me about the China perspective in Asia, and what do they want out of it? What do they want out of Korea, and what do they want out of us?
China likes North Korea being used as a proxy and as a state that will cause trouble for the United States in the region. But when North Korea tests underground nuclear devices with a yield of 250 kilotons or more, which it probably tested in September of 2017, North Korea has crossed a line. And I think China realizes that these weapons it was willing to tolerate, as long as it was an annoyance to the United States and South Korea, have become a real problem to regional security. These are not weapons to be used as deterrents. These are weapons to drive the United States from the Asia Pacific and to unify the Korean Peninsula on North Korea's terms. North Korea does not need a missile that can hit the east coast of the United States to defend its sovereignty. These are offensive weapons, and it's one reason why President Trump has been so tough on North Korea, and it's why the president made progress in 2017 and 2018 and to get China to finally start complying with UN sanctions on the North, and this helped bring Kim to the negotiating table. Another brilliant thing the president did is that when he met with Kim in Singapore and Vietnam, China wasn't there. This was great. It prevented China an opportunity to manipulate the talks to its advantage, to play deal maker. We don't want to have six-party talks again that China runs, talks in Beijing, where China will get an agreement that may lower tensions but mostly promotes China's interests. The president was smart, and I'm sure you played a role in this, KT, to say, if we have talks with North Korea, we're not going to let China run them, they're not going to be at the table. All the Democratic presidential candidates, they're saying this is a solution. It is not. Now look, we want China to help us, and we've been pressing the Chinese government to press North Korea to live up to its obligations, to denuclearize, because if there are more powerful underground nuclear tests that could be H-bombs, they're going to breach the surface. They're going to leak radiation into the atmosphere, and this radiation is going to drift over China and over South Korea. We have to make this point to China. It is in their national interest, in their security interest, to get tensions to be lowered permanently, to get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, and to make it clear that it does not need these weapons as any type of security guarantee. There's no possibility of an American invasion of North Korea. North Korea should recognize that, and we need China to help make that point.
I think I'd like to, people have questions, right? I think we could have a really good conversation by throwing this open. And then if it's okay with the three of you, let's ask the audience to ask you some questions, and then maybe I'll give you each a minute or so to sum up at the end. And what I'd also like you to do in your final remarks is say, how can we, the conservative movement in the United States, which is thriving, we've elected a president against all odds, how can we help you encourage that in your own countries? Okay, so let's throw it open to questions. Stand up and speak loudly, and I'll repeat, sir. I don't think we have mics to pass around, so you speak loudly and I'll repeat it if nobody can hear it.
In keeping with the conversation in this particular subject, and that ties to what China's been doing
Let's
do it. Let's do it this way. If you have a question, oh, we have a mic. Oh, look at this. CPAC is getting so organized. In the good old days, we would have one mic and we'd pass it around. We were so cheap. Okay, so speak into the mic, ask your question, and we'll see who wants to take it. We can hear you.
Is it on? Okay. In keeping with, as sensitized with the likes of Michael Pillsbury and Gordon Chang on what China's expectations are and what they've been doing both overtly and subversively, what is going on with regard to pressure that might be brought downhill on the South Korea with regard to the economy or getting them closer in alignment with what China's expectations are? Is it anything serious?
So what you're saying is what pressure is China bringing on South Korea?
South Korea in comparable terms to what it's done like in the African continent and other areas.
Anybody want to take that? Yeah, sir, Mr. Ambassador. You can explain China's policy to us.
Well, as you know, during the Korean War, that's a long time ago, 1950 to 1953, 300,000 Chinese troops intervened. That was only the reason why the U.S. and South Korea was not able to unify the peninsula at that time. So that memory is still with us. Now, in 1992, finally, ROK and China established diplomatic relations. And for some time, relations were actually okay. But now China has changed. China just threw away the advice of Deng Xiaoping when it comes to its external policies. Deng Xiaoping advised that China should hide the light of the sword and be not very proactive and aggressive. But now the current Chinese government is pursuing different policies. For one, actually Chinese airplanes and Chinese vessels are having exercises very close to Korean Peninsula, something they have never done up until 2014. So we are witnessing with our own eyes that Chinese military are becoming much more assertive and aggressive, and they're targeting South Korea. So that's acutely recognized by the South Korean public. That is why the public perception of China has shifted from 2010 to 2020. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is we have rather famous the Chinese economic coercive diplomacy against my country, especially after my government's decision to have the missile defense system deployed on the peninsula. Our tourism sector, our industrial sector, all of us suffered a lot. But there's a silver lining out of all this. That is, now Korean business sector, without encouragement from the government necessarily, is actually diversifying its investment overseas. Before that time, Korean businesses built factories and invested heavily in China. We are very close, and it's a good destination for investment, they thought. But after what happened around this missile defense deployment, they suffered a economic disadvantage investing in China. So they diversified, and they diversify in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. So whole attitude and posture of the Korean people and Korean government, if it's a conservative Korean government, about China has shifted for the last 10 years. So this is something, I think that will linger on, because China's attitudes has not changed. It's becoming more aggressive, more assertive.
Okay, Dr. Sher, do you want to jump in for a second?
If I may add to what the ambassador said about the China's influence in the domestic politics of South Korea. A very good example just recently, like yesterday, is that because of the coronavirus spreading, the conservatives are gathering up, and also some of the liberals are waking up, and there is a very high anti-government movement. And actually there is a online petition that has been going on to impeach the President Moon. And the online petition has garnered about more than 1 million votes in less than a week. The coronavirus started spreading only last week. So in less than a week, it garnered about 1 million votes. But just 2 days ago, there was another petition that came up on the website, which opposed the vote to impeach the President Moon Jae-in. And it was revealed yesterday that petition was created by a Chinese in Korea. And he was spreading in his WeChat or the group talk, like groups and chat rooms among the Chinese to come and vote. He was sending the links out to his Chinese friends in Korea and also in China.
Does anybody know why? Is it just because Korea is so close to China that there are so many more cases in Korea now of coronavirus?
Yes, it's not just necessarily about the virus itself, but current President Moon Jae-in is not only pro-North and very leftist, but he's very pro-China. Most of the conservatives in Korea believe that he's really degrading the country as a vassal state or a tributary state like we were when we were a dynasty. And Xi Jinping is really treating Korea like a vassal state. The ambassador said that the Chinese policy has changed in the last 10 years, but that's true. It has changed in its outward policies, but deep inside, their psychology of looking at the neighboring countries has always been for the last 1,000 years as a vassal state.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point to make, though, about the United States has allies and we have friends. China has vassals, and it's a very different relationship. Let's have another question. Yes, sir.
Park Geun-hye.
Yeah, wait for the mic.
President Park Geun-hye was sentenced 33 years, not 25 years. Yes.
I was wrong there.
And President Moon appointed over 20 Jusapa communists in the cabinet. Very important post. It really, really angered our conservative Koreans like me. So I think he's deserved to be called a communist because of his many actions. And I really wish you could explain the baneful influence of Jusapa and that 23 or 24 important men, staff in Blue House. They did not confess. They are converted.
I think I should explain what
Answer this one
Jusapa.
quickly, because I want to make sure that we get Fred Fleiss, who normally we will not have access to. We're going to milk him for all he's worth. Okay.
Oh, you want to quickly explain?
No, you make a quick answer
Okay.
to that question.
I think he used the term called Jusapa. Maybe I should explain this. Jusapa basically means Juche Sasang followers. Juche Sasang is the Juche ideology, North Korea's official ideology, followers in South Korea. So they actually want South Korea to become like North Korea. They worship the lineage of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. So they want they want Korea unified, but as a
North Korean,
North Korea,
yeah, on North Korea's terms.
They are called Jusapa. And Moon Jae-in, when he was elected, he employed into his cabinet 20 Jusapa members, and they haven't retracted their former previous thoughts officially at all.
All right, and any other questions here? Then I'm going to ask Fred Fleiss, where does this go? So President Trump, let's assume he gets reelected, because we're all going to really work for his reelection. What happens in a second Trump term?
I'm so glad you asked me this, because I've given a lot of thought to it, and I've given some advice to the Trump administration. These lower level talks have been stuck, and we have to get them moving. We need to have monthly talks between a senior rep of the president and a senior rep of Kim. I think Jared Kushner should be named for monthly talks because he's close to the president.
Poor Jared Kushner.
I know, and I have not asked him this. Look, I'm sorry.
He's a really good friend of mine, and every time nobody
know,
can
but
figure out that, let's have Jared do it.
We need to get the dialogue moving. We need somebody who the Kim government can't turn down. And look, you're going to laugh at this. We should send Dennis Rodman also.
Trump called Dennis Rodman
listen.
before he met him. Yeah.
In Vietnam, Kim said, send me famous basketball players. Let's do what we have to do before we talk about sanctions or something that could start a war. It's silly. I know it sounds silly. Let's send some famous basketball players with Jared to give the message to Kim. You have to start the monthly talks with the United States to lower tensions. It's unorthodox. It's not something other presidents should do. But the alternative is tensions increasing and more tests of nuclear devices. So I know that sounds crazy. Look, you know the president better than I do, KT.
He picked up the phone and called Dennis Rodman. We were trying to brief him on the meetings he was going to have with Kim, when he said, I'll bring him into the Oval Office if conditions are right. And he said, maybe I'll call Dennis. He literally called Dennis Rodman, because we went around, and the intelligence community, we tried to ask, well, who's met this guy? You know, who really knows and gets inside the mind of Kim Jong-un? Because Hermit Kingdom, and a guy who nobody's really met. And then somebody said, well, you know, the American who spent the most time with him was Dennis Rodman. Yeah. So Donald Trump took his foreign policy advice from Dennis Rodman, and I have to say that it worked out pretty well because he got the guy to the negotiating table. Yeah. So where do you think it goes? I mean, is this all dependent on which government the South Koreans have? Will a conservative government stand up to North Korea? Will a continuation of a socialist government lead to a North-South Korea unification on North Korea's terms?
Of course, we have to prevent that. America has to help us prevent Korea being handed over to a North Korean state. And that's why we're at CPAC, and that's why we need CPAC in Korea as well. We have had one CPAC last year, so we are struggling. The conservatives are struggling. They are still divided. And one of the factors of division is the Trump's policy, because after he met with Kim Jong-un, the conservatives were very furious because he was actually putting Kim Jong-un, a dictator, murderer for our nation, into an international stage. So you have to understand what the conservatives may have felt. And other conservatives also said that there is a plan. There is a plan. I was one of them, and President Trump knows what he's doing, and he definitely is trying to turn all the pages and eventually expose that the North Korean regime is never interested in denuclearization. So that's some of the conservatives are also thinking that. And actually, I can talk a bit about the North Korean denuclearization. You said that we don't know what North Koreans mean by the word denuclearization, but I've done my dissertation on this, and I've found out that the word denuclearization in English, the first time the North Koreans used the English word denuclearization is at a conference they held in 1977, and it was an international conference. They invited all the non-members, non-aligned movement members, and they held this big conference called the International Denuclearization Conference of the Korean Peninsula. And the denuclearization that they meant at the time was not the Americans. And it's not just, at the time there were some tactical missiles in South Korea, and that they were meaning to remove that. But not just that, but the nuclear umbrella that the US was providing over Korea and also Japan. They wanted it removed. And this was the time when Kim Il-sung was actually trying to get the nuclear stockpiles and technology from Iran, from other countries. So, and I think what they mean by denuclearization hasn't changed.
No, they want to get rid of everybody else's nuclear weapons and keep their own. Let me tell you, I think that this is an important point to make. So President Trump, Fred Fleiss and I and others recommended, okay, here's what you do with the North Koreans. You have a combination of carrots and sticks. You don't let up the pressure, like you said. When they show up at a negotiating table, you don't say, oh, great. You just keep churning the dial up and up and up. But I think Trump on his own, just because he's such a unique, think outside the box kind of guy, I think he's figured out a third way of manipulating and leverage. So it's not just carrots, it's not just sticks. I think he's scrambling with Kim Jong-un's head. And Trump, when he basically said, okay, let's negotiate, and he said, yeah, I'd welcome into the Oval Office if it works out, what he did was carefully chosen. Now, I'm not speaking for him because I don't work for him anymore, but when he said the first meeting between Kim Jong-un and Trump took place in Singapore, think about the symbolism of that. Singapore, 30 or 40 years ago, was a backward country. Singapore is now the most modern and sophisticated country in the world, and by bringing Kim to Singapore, he's saying to Kim, in just by showing him, not just telling him about it, but he could see for himself, this could be you, this could be your country. The second meeting they had, which they almost didn't have because Trump was he'll walk away from anything if he thinks he's not being played fair with. But the second meeting was also carefully chosen, and that was in Vietnam, in Saigon. And what message does that send to Kim? It says the United States and Vietnam fought a vicious war for a decade. And that wasn't all that long ago. It was my era's war. And he's saying to Kim, again, demonstrating to him, this is a country, it's still a communist country, but we have good relations with them. We trade with them. This too could be you, North Korea. And I think that finally he understands that Kim Jong-un, he doesn't care about his people. They're starving. He doesn't really care. He cares about himself. And if you look at the pictures, the body language between Trump and Kim Jong-un, between Trump and Kim Jong-un at Panmunjom when he welcomes him into North Korea to step in, Kim is having the time of his life. You know, the best thing was ever going to happen to him was Dennis Rodman. Now he has the leader of the free world who is treating him like a world figure. And Trump made this trailer movie, this movie about this could be you, Kim. You could be a great leader. This could be Korea. Everybody in the Western media made fun of it. But Kim took it seriously because he wants to be better than Dad and better than Gramps. And he wants to be the guy who takes North Korea into a different place. So what Trump, when people have said to Trump, well, you're giving him legitimacy on the world stage, he craves it. Well, that's the point. He craves it. Trump gives it, Trump can take it away. And Trump will have no problem walking away from a negotiation with Kim. You know, he's already tweeted, my missiles are bigger than your missiles. And he's already tweeted, but we send each other love letters. Trump will have no problem walking away from Kim and tweeting that, oh, the guy just wasn't serious. But I think it gives Kim some real problems because Kim has shown to the North Korean people this could be a better life. By shaking that hand with Donald Trump, he has given an implicit promise to the Koreans. So I think as conservatives here, the important thing for us is to support our Korean friends in their quest for freedom and understanding that they're facing down the biggest gorillas in the world, not just the socialists in their own country, but the communists right across the border. Thank you very much, Ambassador Cho, Dr. Cho, and my friend Fred Price. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.